7. She was my neighbor, elegant and untouchable, until the night she whispered, "I shouldn't be doing this." And all I could say was, "But you can't stop." I never thought much about neighbors. You nod when you pass them in the hall, maybe wave from across the yard, and then keep on with your life. But the first time I really noticed her, it was as though the world decided to slow down just enough for me to catch something I wasn't meant to miss. She was standing in front of her small garden, a pair of gloves in her hands, brushing soil from her palms as the evening light stretched gold across the street. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and jasmine, and in that quiet moment, I caught myself watching her. She wasn't trying to be graceful, yet every movement had that effortless kind of elegance that only comes with time and confidence. Her hair, streaked with just a touch of silver, fell over her shoulder in soft waves that the breeze kept teasing. The sun caught it in places, turning strands into threads of copper and honey. She wasn't dressed up, just a simple blouse, sleeves rolled back, and dark jeans that still somehow looked refined on her. But what struck me wasn't her beauty alone. It was the calm about her, the way she carried herself as if she'd lived through storms and still learned to walk steady afterward. I must have been staring longer than I realized, because she looked up. Her eyes caught mine. Not sharp, not questioning, just warm, curious, the kind of look that makes you feel like you've been seen completely, without judgment. I felt my chest tighten, a ripple of something unfamiliar. "Evening," she called lightly, her voice low, husky at the edges. It wasn't a flirt, just a neighborly greeting. But the sound of it stayed with me longer than it should have. I managed a smile, my throat a little dry. "Evening." She lifted her basket of garden tools, brushing her palms against her jeans, leaving faint streaks of soil. "You must be the new one across the hall." I nodded, stepping closer just enough that I didn't have to raise my voice. "Yeah, just moved in last week." Her lips curved, not quite a smile, more like the hint of one. "Welcome, then. I'm Claire." Claire. The name fit her, strong, classic, with a softness that lingered. We only spoke for a minute or two, about the building, the neighborhood, nothing that should matter. But the details blurred, because what stayed with me was the way her eyes held mine when she spoke. There was depth there, layers I wanted to read like a book I hadn't known I was searching for. When she finally excused herself, carrying her basket inside, the air felt a little emptier without her. I stood there longer than I should have, pretending to admire the flowers she'd left behind, though really I was just trying to steady the strange pull in my chest. It was just a first meeting. Nothing more. But something about her, her poise, her voice, that simple look in the fading light, had already left a mark. And I knew, even then, that this was not the kind of neighbor I could forget. It started with something small. It always does. I was heading up the stairs, arms full of groceries, when I saw her again, Claire. She was struggling with a bag herself, keys dangling from her fingers, her brow furrowed in concentration. Without thinking, I spoke. "Here, let me help with that." She hesitated, glancing at me with a mixture of pride and relief. Then she sighed softly and handed over the bag. "Thank you." I usually manage, but today seems heavier than usual. The bag wasn't just groceries. It was glass jars, fruit, a bottle of wine, and something fragrant that smelled faintly of rosemary. I followed her down the hall, my shoulder brushing hers once when the space grew narrow. The brief contact was enough to make me aware of every detail, the warmth of her presence, the faint perfume she wore, something floral but understated. When we reached her door, she pushed it open with her hip and motioned me inside. "You can just set it on the counter." Her apartment was different from mine, lived in, but in a way that felt warm and curated. Stacks of books sat on the side table. A soft throw rested across the couch, and the faint aroma of brewed tea lingered in the air. She moved around me with an ease that made the space feel smaller, closer. "Would you like some tea?" I just made a pot. I almost declined. I didn't want to intrude, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. "Sure, thank you." She poured into 2 delicate cups, the steam curling upward, carrying with it the earthy scent of chamomile. When she handed me one, our fingers brushed. Just a fleeting touch, but it sent a quiet spark through me. We sat by the window, the evening spilling in soft shades of orange and pink. What began as small talk stretched unexpectedly. She asked about my work, my family, the adjustment of moving somewhere new. I found myself answering more openly than I expected, because she listened in a way that felt different, her eyes steady, her attention unbroken. When I asked about her, her responses carried both confidence and a quiet kind of vulnerability. She spoke about her career, her love for books and music, the comfort of routine, and then, almost too quickly, she'd switch the subject, as though catching herself from revealing too much. At one point she laughed, not loud, but full, warm, with a slight rasp that made it linger in my chest. I watched her eyes crease at the corners, noticed how her hand hovered near mine on the armrest, almost touching but not quite. The air between us grew thick in those pauses, the silences saying more than the words did. By the time I finished my tea, I realized we'd been talking for nearly an hour. I stood reluctantly, not wanting to break the spell. She walked me to the door, her hand resting lightly on the frame as she leaned there. "I'm glad we met properly," she said softly. Her words were simple, but the way she held my gaze made them feel heavier, like they carried something neither of us was ready to name yet. And as I stepped back into the hall, I knew this was no ordinary neighborly kindness. It was something else, something quietly pulling us closer, no matter how much we tried to keep it casual. The more time I spent with Claire, the easier it became to forget that she wasn't just another friend. Conversations flowed so naturally, laughter came so freely, that I stopped noticing how long I stayed in her apartment, or how often I found myself listening for her footsteps in the hallway. But one evening, something shifted. It was raining outside, the kind of steady drizzle that makes the world feel smaller, quieter. She invited me in again, this time with the excuse of sharing dinner. The table was simple: pasta, bread, a bottle of that same red wine I'd helped her carry up the stairs weeks before. We talked the way we always did, about books, about movies, about the strange quirks of the people who lived in the building. But somewhere in the middle of that conversation, her laughter slowed. She set her glass down, fingers circling the rim, and her eyes flickered away from mine. "You know," she began softly, almost as if she were testing the words before committing to them, "I shouldn't be this comfortable with you." The room seemed to still. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just let her voice carry, because I could feel it came from a place deeper than casual conversation. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders sinking as though the admission itself carried weight. "You're younger. You're different from the people I usually spend time with. And yet," her eyes finally met mine, sharp for just a moment before softening again. "And yet I catch myself forgetting all the reasons why I shouldn't." I felt something stir in me, not triumph, not pride, but a quiet ache. She wasn't simply stating the obvious, she was admitting to a battle within herself. I leaned forward slightly, careful not to break the fragile space between us. "Is that a bad thing?" I asked, my voice barely above the rain tapping at the window. Her lips parted, as though she wanted to answer, but then she closed them again. She shook her head gently, almost to herself, and her hand slipped away from where it had rested near mine on the table. I felt the absence immediately, like a thread had been cut. "I just don't want to mislead either of us," she said finally. "Sometimes I think I'm opening doors that should stay closed." Her honesty carried both strength and vulnerability. It was a confession and a warning in one. I could see the way her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, as if grounding herself against feelings she couldn't control. I wanted to reach across the table, to take her hand and reassure her, but I stayed still. Not because I didn't want to, but because I sensed she needed the space. Instead, I offered her a smile, small, genuine. "Maybe some doors aren't meant to stay closed forever." She held my gaze a second longer, her expression unreadable, and then she let out the faintest laugh. But it wasn't amusement. It was the sound of someone caught between resistance and surrender. That night, when I left her apartment, the rain had eased. Yet I carried her words with me, heavy and unshakable. For the first time, the unspoken thing between us wasn't just an undercurrent. It had surfaced, fragile, undeniable, and impossibly real. After that night, when she admitted she felt too close to me, something in the air between us changed. Not in a way that pushed us apart. If anything, it pulled us tighter. It was as though the words had cracked open a door we couldn't quite shut again. From then on, every little moment seemed to linger longer than it should. One evening, we ended up walking home together. I'd spotted her leaving the small grocery shop down the street, carrying a paper bag against her hip. I offered to walk with her. She hesitated for half a second, then gave a small nod. The sidewalk was narrow, which meant our shoulders brushed every few steps. At first it felt accidental, but after a while either of us shifted away. The night air carried the faint scent of rain-soaked pavement, and the glow of street lamps wrapped the world in a soft, golden haze. She spoke about small things, a new book she was reading, how the neighbors on the third floor argued too loudly, but her voice carried a warmth that made everything sound more intimate than it was. I remember her pointing toward the sky, where the clouds had just begun to break, revealing a thin slice of moon. Her hand lifted close to mine, and for a moment I wanted to lace my fingers through hers. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence stretch, our steps falling into the same rhythm, as if we'd been walking together like this for years. Another night, she invited me over under the excuse of sharing music. She had a small collection of records stacked by her player, the sleeves worn but cared for. When she lowered the needle, soft jazz filled the room. She sat close beside me on the couch, close enough that her knee brushed mine whenever she shifted. At one point, she leaned in, her hair falling over her shoulder as she reached to adjust the volume. The faint brush of her sleeve against my arm sent a ripple through me. When she settled back, her perfume lingered in the space between us, something delicate, impossible to ignore. We didn't speak much then. We didn't need to. The music filled the silence, but underneath it was the weight of everything unspoken. I found myself memorizing the curve of her profile in the lamplight, the way her lips pressed together when she was lost in thought. Then there was the evening with the wine. She laughed too hard at one of my clumsy jokes, and in the middle of her laughter, the glass nearly slipped from her hand. Instinctively, I reached out, my hand closing gently over hers to steady it. Her laughter faltered, softening into silence, and suddenly all I could feel was the warmth of her skin against mine. She didn't pull away right away. Her fingers stayed beneath mine, her eyes flickering to our joined hands before lifting to meet mine. For a heartbeat, either of us breathed. Then, with a small, nervous smile, she eased her hand back, as though nothing had happened. But the truth was clear, everything had. From then on, it was impossible to pretend these moments were meaningless. Each touch, each glance, every pause between words carried more weight than either of us dared admit aloud. And still, we let it happen, these small, lingering moments that spoke louder than confessions ever could. It happened on a night that didn't feel remarkable at first. I'd stopped by her apartment to return a book she had lent me. She opened the door in a soft cardigan, her hair loosely tied back, strands falling across her cheek. She smiled when she saw me, tired but welcoming. "Come in for a minute," she said. "I was just making tea." The minutes stretched, the way they always did with her. We sat on her couch, the low lamplight giving the room a warm glow. A record hummed softly in the background, its crackling filling the silence between our words. I handed her the book, and she set it aside, though her fingers lingered on its cover as if stalling. We talked quietly at first, about nothing in particular. But as the night deepened, her voice grew softer, her pauses longer. I noticed the way she leaned back into the cushions, one hand resting against her neck, as if carrying a weight she couldn't put down. Then, all at once, the conversation stopped. She was looking at me in a way she hadn't before, not just with warmth, but with hesitation. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Finally, she whispered, barely audible, "I shouldn't be doing this." The words hung in the air, fragile and final. She turned her gaze away, as though ashamed of having said them out loud. My chest tightened. I could have agreed, could have stepped back, given her the distance she thought she needed. But instead, something inside me answered before my mind could catch up. You can't stop. Her eyes snapped back to mine, wide with surprise. For a long, still moment, we just sat there, staring at each other. The room seemed to shrink until it was only the two of us, the air thick with the tension I could feel in every nerve. She pressed her lips together, shaking her head slightly, but she didn't move away. Instead, she drew a shaky breath and leaned back against the couch. Her hand, which had been gripping the fabric of her sweater, loosened and rested on the cushion between us. It was close, so close that if I shifted even slightly, my fingers would brush hers. I didn't move. Neither did she. But the space between us felt like fire. I know this isn't right, she whispered, her voice trembling. But every time you're here, I forget why I keep telling myself that. Her vulnerability cut through me. She wasn't playing games. She was caught in the same pull I was, something neither of us had asked for, yet couldn't seem to resist. I wanted to reach for her, to close that impossible inch between us. But I didn't. Not yet. Because the truth was, the tension wasn't in the touch we hadn't shared, it was in the fact that we wanted to. That night ended with nothing more than silence. She walked me to the door, her hand resting on the frame as though steadying herself. I stepped out into the hall, my pulse racing, her words echoing inside me. I shouldn't be doing this. And my reply, unshakable now. But you can't stop. It wasn't a declaration. It was the truth neither of us could escape anymore. After that night, after her whisper and my reply, things were different. We never spoke directly about what happened, the words we'd exchanged, the silence that followed. But the weight of it lived in every glance, every pause, every moment we found ourselves alone together. One evening, she invited me over with a simple text. I made too much dinner. Come help me finish it. I told myself it was nothing more than kindness, the same neighborly warmth she'd shown from the beginning. But as soon as she opened the door, I knew better. Her eyes softened when she saw me, and in that look was everything unspoken. Dinner was quiet. Comfortable, but quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't need filling because both people already know what's being said beneath it. When we finished, she poured us each a glass of wine, and we moved to the couch. The record player hummed again, the soft melody curling around us. I sat close, maybe closer than usual, and she didn't shift away. If anything, she leaned toward me, her shoulder brushing mine as though it belonged there. For a while, we didn't speak at all. She rested her glass on the table, then pulled the blanket from the couch over her lap. Without asking, she draped the other end across me, a quiet invitation to share her space. I felt her warmth radiate through the thin space between us. And then, slowly, carefully, she let her head tilt until it rested lightly against my shoulder. My breath caught. I didn't dare move. The weight of her against me was delicate but certain, as if she'd finally allowed herself to stop resisting. Her hair brushed against my jaw, carrying the faint scent of lavender. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. Her cheek against my shoulder, my arm pressed lightly against hers. At one point, I shifted slightly, and she adjusted too, slipping just a little closer, as though afraid I might pull away if she didn't anchor herself. I could feel her heartbeat. Not clearly, but in the subtle rise and fall of her breath, and the unsteady rhythm that gave her away. She wasn't as composed as she always seemed. She was vulnerable, right there against me, and somehow she was letting me hold that part of her without a word. She broke the silence first. You make it too easy, she whispered, her voice almost trembling. I swallowed, my throat dry. Easy for what? Her head shifted slightly against my shoulder, her cheek brushing closer. To forget I'm supposed to stop. I didn't answer. I just let my hand slide slowly, gently, over the blanket until it rested over hers. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand instead, letting our fingers thread together. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden rush of passion. It was quiet. Gentle. The kind of surrender that happens when resisting becomes heavier than giving in. That night, she didn't ask me to leave right away. We sat there until the record stopped spinning, until the wine glasses stood empty, until silence became its own language between us. And in that silence I knew, whatever this was, it had already begun. By the time autumn rolled around, everything between us had changed. What began as passing greetings and neighborly kindness had become something far deeper, something neither of us could pretend away anymore. Every quiet evening, every lingering glance, every touch that stayed a little too long, it all built toward a truth we could no longer deny. One night, the truth finally found its voice. I was at her apartment again, sitting on the same couch where so much of this had begun. The room glowed with the soft light of a single lamp, the record player spinning something low and steady in the background. She sat close beside me, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her expression calm but unreadable. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable, like a pause before the final note of a song. Then she turned to me, her eyes searching mine with a kind of fragile honesty I hadn't seen before. "I don't know where this is going," she admitted softly. "I don't know if it's wise or fair, or even something I should allow myself to want." She paused, her breath catching slightly. "But I do. I want this. I want you." The words hit me with the force of something I had been waiting to hear without even realizing it. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened, but I didn't speak right away. I let the weight of her confession settle between us, because I knew it hadn't been easy for her to say. Slowly, I reached out and covered her hands with mine. Her fingers tensed for a moment, then relaxed, curling softly into my touch. I felt the warmth of her skin, the unsteady rhythm of her breathing. "You don't have to know where it's going," I said quietly. "We don't need to have it all figured out. All we need is to stop pretending it isn't real." Her lips trembled into the faintest smile. She lifted one hand to my face, her palm cupping my cheek with a gentleness that sent a rush through me. Her thumb brushed along my jawline, lingering as if memorizing the moment. "You make it sound so simple," she whispered. "Because it is," I murmured, leaning just slightly into her touch. "It's us. And that's enough." For a moment, everything stilled. Then she closed the distance, not with a kiss, but by leaning forward, resting her forehead lightly against mine. The contact was tender, steady, grounding. I felt her breath mix with mine, warm and fragile. We stayed that way, eyes closed, holding on to the quiet as though it was all that mattered. And in that stillness, something shifted, the hesitation, the resistance, the fear of what others might think. None of it mattered anymore. When she finally pulled back, her eyes glistened in the soft lamplight. She didn't speak again, and she didn't need to. Everything was already said in the way she looked at me, not with doubt, but with acceptance. That night didn't end with fireworks or grand declarations. It ended with a quiet surrender, a gentle promise made without words, that whatever came next, we would face it together. And for me, that was enough. More than enough.